Good morning to everyone. I'm really glad to be here, and I'm just glad that we can encourage each other. I hope that everyone is encouraged here this morning, and I hope more than that God is glorified also. So in continuing the focus that we have this morning on service, I want to talk about being a Christian servant. And it might seem like with having a class and a sermon and having a sermon a couple weeks ago on service, that we are trying to make a big deal out of being a servant. But the truth is that we don't really have to make a big deal out of being a servant because the Bible makes a big deal out of being a servant. And hopefully that'll be clear, especially after the sermon this morning. So first of all, there's some pretty straightforward information that probably wouldn't surprise anyone about being a servant. But as we go along, we're going to get to some more information about servanthood that is surprising and that has surprised and shocked people throughout history, and that some people don't like, to be quite honest. First of all, some pretty straightforward information. Godly men in the Bible identified themselves as servants of God and as servants of Jesus Christ. When Simeon knows that the Savior is coming into the world, he says to God, "You're allowing your servant to die in peace." Then Paul, James, Peter, Jude, and John all open up letters that they've written by referring to themselves in the first verse of their letters as bondservants of Jesus Christ. And I don't think that these men all met together in one place at one time and conspired to all start their letters the same way. I think the Holy Spirit was guiding them to identify themselves as bondservants of Christ. And it's interesting to see that phrase coming up time and again from different authors writing different books. Also, the title of servant is a title of honor that is given to other men. David is referred to as a servant of God in Luke 1:69. And Paul refers to the following people as servants in his writings: Phoebe, Epaphras, Tychicus, and Timothy. And, for some of these people, I couldn't tell you much of anything that they did that I know of specifically as servants. But sometimes that's the way it is with a servant. The things that they do aren't remembered. Maybe the things that they do aren't even noticed. But Paul tells us that they were servants, and we know that he's giving them this title of honor, that they saw something that needed to be done and they did it. Not surprisingly, Jesus tells us to become servants. He says, "Whoever wishes to become great among you shall be your servant." In Mark 9:35, he said, "If anyone wants to be first, he shall be last of all and servant of all." And in Luke 22:26, he said, "The one who is the greatest among you must become like the youngest, and the leader like the servant." Now, it's not surprising that he tells us to become servants, but it's a little bit counterintuitive that Jesus says if you want to be great, you should become a servant. If you want to be first, you should be last of all and servant of all. But I think most people would be okay with this. They could accept this teaching. Now, I like to compare Christianity to other religions and to other worldviews to help gain perspective. And I think that this sermon, just getting started, so far I could have said these general concepts to a Muslim audience, and they would have probably been okay with it. They would have said, yeah, it's great to be a servant. We agree entirely. The title of servant is a title of honor, and we are glad that people want to serve God. They would probably even say, yes, Jesus tells us to become servants. We're happy about that. But I think the remainder of the sermon probably wouldn't sit well with them at all. The remainder of the sermon suggests, as the Bible suggests, that Jesus Christ himself was a servant, and the implication is that a member of the Godhead came to earth to be a servant to men. The implication is that God is serving us. So in John chapter 13, we read, "Jesus, knowing that the Father has given all things into his hands, and that he had come forth from God and was going back to God, got up from supper, and laid aside his garments. And taking a towel, he girded himself. Then he poured water into the basin and began to wash the disciples' feet, and to wipe them with the towel with which he was girded. So when he had washed their feet and taken his garments and reclined at the table again, he said to them, "Do you know what I have done to you? You call me teacher and Lord, and you are right, for so I am. If I then, the Lord and the teacher, wash your feet, you also ought to wash one another's feet. For I gave you an example that you should do as I did to you." We've read these verses in this passage perhaps many times, but the astounding thing is that the Son of God decided to wash people's feet, and it literally physically happened on the earth in history. It's just the same as if he came in here this morning and began washing our feet. The very concept that the Word made flesh, who John says was in the beginning with God and was God, that God became flesh and washed people's feet and became a servant in that capacity, is shocking when you come to understand it. We wouldn't expect the President of the United States to come in here and wash our feet. Now, how much less importance, though there is a lot of importance in that position, how much less importance is there in the President of the United States than in the Creator of the universe? We wouldn't expect the CEO of a large company to come in here and start washing our feet. And yet, Jesus Christ came to earth and started washing feet. And he said that he did this as an example that we should follow him. Jesus is a servant. Matthew 12:18 and these various verses in Acts refer to Jesus as a servant of God. And I think that's easier for us to accept because we see God the Father and God the Son and the Holy Spirit serving and loving and cherishing each other in a special kind of relationship in the Godhead. But Jesus Christ, God the Son, is also a servant of men. Romans 15:8 says, Christ has become a servant to the circumcision, that is, to the Jews, on behalf of the truth of God, to confirm the promises given to the fathers. Philippians 2:7 says, He emptied himself, taking the form of a bondservant, and being made in the likeness of men. When Jesus came to earth, he said, Foxes have holes and birds have nests, but the Son of Man has nowhere to lay his head. He did not come as someone who had a palace and who had a nice bed to lay in at night. He came and lived the life of a servant, and he lived a life of poverty. Excuse me. And he lived a life in which he did things like washing people's feet, walking long distances on foot, to serve other people, to pour himself out for other people. So really, the part of this that wouldn't sit well with a lot of people, the part of it that's shocking when you realize it, is when you say Jesus is a servant. If you believe that Jesus is God, you're saying God is a servant. And it just seems totally counterintuitive to say that the God of the universe, the Creator, is a servant. It just seems like it ought not to be. So the question is, why? Why did Jesus come to serve? And he didn't just come to wash people's feet. He didn't just come to stand out in the heat and preach to people. He also came to die, to be tortured by the Roman government on a crucifix. Why on earth did God send his Son to do that? First of all, I wanted to be clear, it's not because he had no choice in the matter. It's not because he said, I would never choose to be a servant, I would never choose to die for these people, but unfortunately, I'm being forced to. I base that on 1 Peter 1:18 through 21. It says, You are not redeemed with perishable things, like silver or gold from your futile ways, or life inherited from your forefathers, but with precious blood, as of a lamb unblemished and spotless, the blood of Christ. For he was foreknown before the foundation of the world, but has appeared in these last times for the sake of you, who through him are believers in God. Now, before the foundation of the world had been laid, before God had created earth or created people, he already knew that we were going to need someone to come to earth and to serve us. And he had already chosen Jesus Christ to do that. So it's not as if God created a world with no intention of being a servant to us, and was surprised by the fact that we sinned and thought, now I've been forced into service. I've been forced to be a servant to these people. I have no choice. No, from the beginning, God had a plan to create a world which he knew would need help, and he planned to send Jesus Christ to be our servant from the beginning. It seems that being of service to others and loving others and putting others first is in God's very nature. So why is it that he sent his Son to be a servant to us? Because in John 3:16, God so loved the world. Because as 1 John 4:8 puts it, God is love. To be loving is to serve someone else. It's not just to do what's best for you, it's to do what is best for them. And I'd like to turn to Matthew chapter 25. This isn't on the screen because we're going to read a longer passage than normal. But in answering the question, why would Jesus Christ be a servant? What is it about being a servant that has anything to do with being divine? I think we can learn from the parable of the talents. Matthew 25, beginning in verse 14 and going all the way through verse 30. So we often think of this passage just in terms of using the gifts that God has given us. And this passage is about using what God gives us. But the people who have been given a gift are servants, and God expects them to behave in a certain way. So as we start in Matthew 25:14, for it is just like a man about to go on a journey, who called his own slaves or his own servants, and entrusted his possessions to them. The one he gave 5 talents, to another 2, to another 1, each according to his own ability. And he went on his journey. So if you were in class this morning, we talked about different gifts that different people have and different ways that we can use those gifts to serve other people. That might be sort of like these talents. Although originally the term talent referred to a large amount of money. If I'm not mistaken, talent was about 20 years' wages. So if you took the average wage in the United States right now, that might be around $800,000. So this guy who got 5 talents, what is that, $4 million? This is a story about a lot of money, about big investment. So it says, immediately, in verse 16, immediately the one who had received the 5 talents went and traded them and gained 5 more talents. In the same manner, the one who had received the 2 talents gained 2 more. But he who received the 1 talent went away and dug a hole in the ground and hid his master's money. So two of the men invest their talents, and one of the men does not invest. Maybe he's afraid that he's going to lose what he has if he risks it. Maybe he's afraid that something won't go right if he uses what his master has given him. But the other 2 invest. Now, I like the image of investment, and especially these large amounts of money, because one thing you can learn from a human economy is that sometimes the whole is greater than the sum of the parts. Sometimes when people come together and cooperate, we can get more when we work together. That's why an economy can have people investing and making more money and no one loses. So these 2 people took what God had given them and they invested and they made more. It's like us taking the gifts and the talents that God gives us and using them and cooperating with other people and making something good out of it. Now when we get to verse 19. Now after a long time the master of those slaves came and settled accounts with them. The one who had received the 5 talents came up and brought 5 more talents, saying, Master, you entrusted 5 talents to me. See, I have gained 5 more talents. His master said to him, Well done, good and faithful slave. You were faithful with a few things. I will put you in charge of many things. Enter into the joy of your master. And also the one who had received the 2 talents came up and said, Master, you entrusted 2 talents to me. See, I have gained 2 more talents. His master said to him, Well done, good and faithful slave. You were faithful with a few things. I will put you in charge of many things. Enter into the joy of your master. So these 2 people took what they'd been given by their master, and they used it in cooperation with other people, and they achieved a greater good. And they were called good and faithful servants. 22 says, or 24 says, And the one also who had received the 1 talent came and said, Master, I knew you to be a hard man, reaping where you did not sow, and gathering where you scattered no seed. And I was afraid, and went away and hid your talent in the ground. See, you have what is yours. But his master answered and said to him, You wicked, lazy slave, you knew that I reap where I did not sow, and gather where I scattered no seed. Then you ought to have put my money in the bank, and on my arrival I would have received my money back with interest. Therefore take away the talent from him, and give it to the one who has 10 talents. So this man received something, but he didn't use it to do anything good. He was afraid, so he didn't invest it. And God said he was a wicked and lazy slave or servant. Now, the reason I go through this parable is for 2 reasons. One, to encourage us to use what we've been given by God and to invest the gifts that we've been given to achieve the greater good, to use them in the service of others. The other is because I think it tells us something about the very nature of God. One of us here might be a 5-talent man, and another a 2, and another a 1-talent person. But God has infinite resources. We could call him the infinite talent man. Or to help us wrap our minds around it, maybe the 1 trillion talent God. Now, if he expects us to take our resources and invest them, wouldn't we expect him to do the same thing? And that's what I see God doing in the course of history and in his creation in the world. He took his infinite power and creativity, and he created a world in which things could go wrong. And he made an investment, if you will. He created a world in which there was an opportunity for loss and an opportunity for gain. And then he cooperated with us and brought everything that he had to the table in order to achieve the greater good. I don't believe that this world exists for no reason. I believe that it exists to achieve a greater good. God was wise when he made it, even when he made it knowing that we would fall and knowing that he would need to serve us. And so what I see is a God who has it in his nature to love and to serve, and who has demonstrated that by creating a world that he knew he would have to serve, and by coming to it and serving us. And I see him asking us to be like him, to use what he gives us in cooperation with others, even when we might risk losing something, that in the end we would have the greater good. In that sense, we are closer to the heart of God when we are serving others, if we are doing menial tasks, if we are just giving of ourselves, than if we were kings in palaces. In that sense, we're more like God and we're more conformed to his image when we're just washing the dishes for someone or sweeping the floor for someone or doing whatever it is that we can do for people. More like God then than whenever we're exercising authority and being served by others. The beautiful thing is that we serve a God who we can give infinite glory because he is that way and because he asks us to be that way. He said, if you want to be the greatest of all, you be the servant of all. Has anyone served any of us more than God has served us? Therefore, he is the greatest of all time. He receives all glory from all of us. That's really what I wanted to say about service this morning. There's something about service and love in the heart of God, and thus he asks for it in us. And thus we can achieve good things by being servants, and he's achieved the greatest things of all. I also want to extend the invitation to you this morning to be baptized into Christ, or to come and ask for help or confess sins. If there's anything that we can do to help you, you can come as we stand and sing.